this layout update, I want to address some things that I left out when I did the initial intro video on this layout, which was more of an overview of the entire project and some of the scenic elements and scenes and places that I wanted to hit. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the details, the overall shape and size of things, layout design, and talk about how I approach the benchwork. All right, let's talk numbers. First thing, this layout lives in a 24 by 28 foot detached garage. And that garage still has to perform some basic garage functions like holding tools, lawn equipment, and of course parking a car in it. And all of that has had some net effect on the layout design, mostly for the good, I think. And we're not getting too far off the numbers here, but the style is an important interjection here. This is a mushroom style layout, in case nobody caught that during the initial tour just by looking at it. And for the uninitiated, a mushroom style layout is a 2-level layout or more if you're able to engineer it, but fundamentally it's 2 levels. And the difference between this and a classical double-deck layout is that rather than building it around the walls with both decks being accessed on the same side, which is pretty typical of model railroad design generally, whether it's single deck or double deck or 5 decks, what we do here instead is make the overall layout footprint a little smaller to have access around both the outside of the construct and the inside. And what this does is it gives us the opportunity to only access the lower level from the outside of the thing. If it was a loop or a donut shape, you'd access the lower level typically from the outside of the donut, and then you'd have some kind of pass through or duck under to where you can get to the inside of the donut and step onto an elevated platform, which allows you access to the upper deck, which is facing towards the inside but not the outside. And the mushroom name comes from the cross-section shape. Basically, the ground that the mushroom is growing in is the lower deck. The stem of the mushroom is the backdrop for that lower deck. And then the head or cap of the mushroom is the upper deck cantilevering back out over the lower deck, and its own backdrop coming up and blocking off access from the lower level, thus forming this kind of mushroom shape. So this being a mushroom style layout means 2 decks. The deck heights on these things I've set at 5 feet and 6 feet 2 inches above the concrete respectively. And these are more or less nominal benchwork heights. Now, this may seem tall, but I'll explain why in a bit. So let me go over it real quick why I made things as high as I did. Now, this seems high right here, and if it wasn't so shallow a scene where it's easy to reach in, even if you're marginally shorter, it's still at a good viewing height. It's still not that hard to get in, uncouple a car, throw a switch, whatever. On a deeper scene, of course, like Rice Yard, it required at least that 9-inch lift in order to bring the apparent benchwork height down. Now, why would I go through all this? Well, number one, it makes it a lot easier to get under here for wiring, maintenance, to store things under there, and most importantly, to duck under this lower level in order to pop up on the other side. It also allowed me to experiment with an idea that I've been wargaming, where when you have these outer elevated platforms, even though they're not as drastic as the one on the inside, it helps kind of reset the base floor level. It gives you like a new 0 in terms of the main floor height. And then when you have to go to an area where you're ducking under, well, now you have the advantage of being able to go lower, which with most floors, obviously, unless you build it that way from the start, you don't have that advantage unless you want to bring a jackhammer to the party. So artificially elevating everything from base level then gives me the opportunity to have that little bit of vertical negative space where I need it. Now, the other thing about a double deck layout is you have to have some way to get from the lower level to the upper level without physically taking the train off the layout piece by piece and then stacking it back up on top. And if you want to do things that way, knock yourself out. And you'll probably want to after several iterations of that. But typically there are 2 common ways of doing it. I've got a third one, which I don't know if anybody else has done, but I kind of thought of it by myself about 20 some odd years ago. The most common form of elevation change on multi-deck railroads is the helix. And there are clever ways to hide that in the layout design. For example, John Armstrong used to refer to like the end of a peninsula or someplace where you had a curve 180 degrees or more as blobs. And if you put that blob in the right place of the track plan and made that the location for your helix, well, that's a great hiding spot for it without taking up any unnecessary space in the overall floor plan of the layout. Another way to approach elevation changes is the no-licks approach. And there are various ways to do this, but the idea is to hide the climb and the elevation change there too in the overall track design itself. More typically, I could think of something like Jim Hediger's Ohio Southern from the 70s. If the track plan had been changed a little bit, a lot of the elevation in his center peninsula, where the tracks kind of wind around and come up to the top of a grade at summit and then come back down again, well, instead of coming back down again, you could just take that little bit of clever mountain running and just have the tracks leave the peninsula that much higher up to a second level. The third approach is the one that I kind of thought of, and I've implemented it here, and that is the whole room single turn helix. And you've seen a bit of this where the trains disappear into this little funnel once they cross Mississippi and literally start climbing the walls all the way around me. And of course, I made this little pop-out scene. I've talked about that. And it continues all the way around. And by the time it gets to where I have to enter the garage and it becomes a duck under, it's actually high enough off the floor that only somebody as tall as me really has to worry about hitting their head on it. That's my approach. So basically the way you could think of these three approaches is either the layout has a helix, the layout is in a helix, which is my approach, or with the no-licks, the layout is the helix. So anyway, that's elevation change. So as far as the track design is concerned, I kind of talked about how I've tried to remain faithful to the track arrangement or geometry in certain areas, even if I had to overlap or compress some parts. And there is at least one area near Overland where I found it necessary to actually simplify the track arrangement there. Number one, because the track that I ended up removing wasn't serving any purpose. And number two, what was actually going on there scenically would not have fit in the space that I created. So I'm freelancing that a little bit, which is most of model railroading anyway, simplifying that arrangement to make it more scenically interesting. And operationally, it won't really affect anything since that track wasn't serving any purpose. Now, one thing I did do the math on was the main line run from Rice Yard to staging or from Burnham staging to Blakeland staging. Since each one of those represents one of the two main lines that cover the entire railroad, the Santa Fe main line run from Rice Yard to Blakeland is clocking in at around 200 feet. That includes the all full room helix and all of that stuff. And that comes in at around 3.5 scale miles, I think. And you lose about a scale mile and a half to the semi-hidden trackage in the climb upwards. And then the Rio Grande run is somewhere between 170 and 180 feet. The CNS Santa Fe main run, if you're running unobstructed, no signals or interruptions, and nominal track speeds, it's probably going to be about 12 to 15 minutes from one end to the other. And then the Rio Grande is coming in somewhere around the 10-minute mark. Alrighty, so down here at ground level, you can see just how dramatic the height of the layout is, considering that I'm about 6'1". So that aside, we're going to talk about the lower level benchwork first and how I put that together. This is, of course, part of the original Rice Yard project, and the way I built that was designed to be modular and portable. So that tended to dominate the style of construction for the rest of the lower level benchwork, and it provides a pretty solid base for stacking the upper level on top of it in the way that a mushroom style layout kind of demands. So in some sections with like Rice Yard, I've simply taken standards like this and attached them to the lower level framing and then to the front of the upper level framing in order to float this side of it over the top on this end. And I've done similar things over here, but I've got other areas where, in lieu of having table legs simply attached to the bottom and then having separate attachments to go to the top, I've actually run a leg straight through all the way down. We can see an example here of how that works, where there's one 2x2, goes all the way to the floor, and then attaches here and here to support this side. And while it does kind of break up the smooth fascia aspect, that's less important than structural support. So I'm gonna let it live. In the lower level benchwork construction, simple and kind of standardized as it is, there were a couple of exceptions to how I supported it on the front side, because this is still a garage. For example, there is a car in my train room right now, even though it's still a garage. But there are other garage type things that need to live underneath the layout and still have ready access to, like my lawnmower, snow blower. I've got my rolling tool bench, the shop vac, and other things that store underneath the layout that still require regular ready access. Now, one of the ways I went about that was, instead of running a row of 2x2 table legs on that side of the layout, like I would under Rice Yard, instead of running that series of 2x2s, I made long L girders out of 3-inch ripped plywood pieces and then supported those in the necessary areas with full 2x4 legs. So uncut, unmilled, just cut them to length. I put a couple of stove bolts underneath to serve as load supports and provide some height adjustment and give it enough strength so that everything wasn't just funneling down to one poor stove bolt. At least it has a buddy to help out. That creates this span that's long enough to support these wide open spaces where I need to move these rather large items in and out of there and prevent that front edge of the layout from sagging, drooping, or collapsing. Another area where the lower level benchwork had to break from the standard is right here where the front end of the car comes underneath it. Again, we don't want table legs in that area, so I ended up building, number one, a marginally thinner section of benchwork. Instead of cutting 3.5-inch plywood pieces for the main runners and everything, I just cut them 2 inches wide, so that already takes 1.5 inches off the clearance, and then moved them higher up from the normal end plate standard, giving me another 1.5 inches or so. So just trying to grab it inch by inch to get as much clearance under there as possible, because this is also the duck under area where you get in from the lower level to the upper level of the layout. However, this makes a pretty thin piece of benchwork, and it spans a distance of almost 8 feet. So I didn't want something like that to sag. So I did two things that ended up making this pretty rigid. I took advantage of a flaw in the plywood tabletop where it was actually bowed in such a way that if I tried to put the good side of it up, it would have created downward pressure towards a sag in the middle of that benchwork. However, because I'm using a smoother roadbed underneath the track itself anyway, the quality of the plywood surface that all of this rides on wasn't that important. So I simply flipped the warped piece upside down. So now the bow was going upward, and attaching that to the framing would then naturally create a sort of upward pressure over that span that helps keep it more rigid. Another thing I did was I added this plywood piece on end just behind that main section of cable. That also serves as kind of a spine for that section and also helps resist any flexing and sag over time. And finally, you add some fascia to both sides of it. I'm still waiting on this section yet. But you add fascia to it and it boxes everything in. And so now it's really rigid. I'll bet you could river dance on this thing and it wouldn't budge. And by the way, no river dancing on my layout. Now let's talk about the upper level benchwork, because that is a horse of a different color and represents a bit of a compromise that I had to make for the sake of this railroad. Now the third dimension of this garage is the ceiling height from the floor, which is 8 feet 2 inches. So that's just good enough to allow for a mushroom design in the first place. If the lower deck is 60 inches and the upper deck is 74 inches, well, that's a 14-inch difference between deck heights, not necessarily the aperture in which you're going to view and operate the railroad. If I used the same 6-inch thick average benchwork style that I used on the lower level, that wasn't going to fly because you only get an 8-inch opening. And even if you were down here, like maybe for me, that would be sort of acceptable in terms of viewing, but gets really cumbersome when you have to start reaching in here and doing scenery and adding details. So I didn't want to do that. So what I did instead was, again, taking 1.5 inches off the usual rip for the structural bits. I made 2-inch wide pieces instead of 3.5 inches. And then for most of the upper deck, at least half of it, the plywood sub-road bed, 3/4 inch AC plywood again, sits directly on that framing. Okay, so that gives me an upper benchwork section that's 2 3/4 inches thick. And then I added another 1/2 inch for the sake of this LED light strip that I mounted under here. So the average opening is 10 3/4. Yes. So even here where I'm standing on a 9-inch elevated platform, which then makes the apparent benchwork height here at 51 inches, it's still good for reaching in, good for visibility. I'm not so far down that I can see all the ugly bits underneath. Having that 3 1/4 inch thick top was part of the compromise to give me just enough of an opening for operability and actually building the layout, and still give me a low enough upper deck height that I only had to climb 14 inches and not 18 or more, which would also serve to make the upper level benchwork height off of the platform maybe too high for even myself. And if I tried to make the platform itself any taller, then I'd be hitting my head on the ceiling and bumping into objects that are hanging there. It would be terribly inconvenient. So all of this was adjusted to be just about Goldilocks in terms of how I move through the railroad. And since I consider myself average height, I figure that should work out for most people. But for the thickness of the components used, the overall style of the benchwork framing itself is similar to the lower level, just a bit thinner to allow for accessibility, visibility, and to allow for a good height on the other side of this backdrop. Now let's talk about how is that mounted. Well, we saw that this side of it is supported by the backdrop of the lower level, the stem of the mushroom. This side of it is suspended from bracketry that I've attached to the ceiling itself. And this is one of those things where when I was doing the ceiling in here, I had to choose between either 1/2 inch sheetrock or 3/8 inch plywood. And I chose the plywood, number one, because it's lighter and doesn't require finishing, but it also allows me to find where all the important structural components are, like the ceiling joists. For the sake of the backdrop, there are some non-structural or semi-structural components like these joiner pieces here that allow the ends of the masonite to be joined together and then puttied up on the other side, and then to help maintain rigidity so that the board doesn't flop back and forth, I added small angle irons at the top of that where appropriate, just to help keep it rigid in this direction. Now here we're at the south end of Littleton, about halfway through the upper level, and this is where the main lines start climbing about 4 inches over the total length of this run to get to the upper staging yard at Blakeland. So come down the steps, back up the steps because I didn't drop the origami floor. We'll talk about that sometime. So this is more or less the scenic end of the railroad on the south end. And at this point we transition into staging. In this area, it functions a lot more like your traditional benchwork in the sense of coming off of the framing directly, and the sub-road bed is on risers to help gain that elevation. And so far the trains have run really well on there. Another thing I'll mention here is we have kind of a break from the traditional mushroom design in this opening that allows access to Rice Yard. Since it's so absurdly wide and up against the back wall there, obviously I needed to create some accessibility for this side of the yard, or it would be nothing more than an overgrown scenic element. So in this area, it does transition over to a more traditional double deck design. And I'm kind of okay with it because by the time you get to this end of the railroad, you're in staging anyway. Now this is the backside of the Jewel Avenue and Broadway section, which is where Kroonenberg Lumber will be located. And you can see it attaches to the layout right there, just on the other end of Overland. So this is kind of its own little isolated switching district, kind of gets you away from the business of the rest of the layout. And it hangs almost entirely off the ceiling. And again, built with that 1x2 plywood framing. And for the top surface, I broke from my usual 3/4 inch plywood and used 1-inch foam insulation board here, just to keep it as lightweight as possible, given that it sits over the top of the car. As much as I don't like laying track on foam, I've had bad luck with the kind of liquid nails I was using at the time. I'm going to give it another try and maybe use some stronger stuff this time. I've already painted the foam so that the glue's not going to eat into it. And it's a very limited amount of track. So if it doesn't work the first time, I'll just try again. It's not that big a deal. Maybe I'll run hat pins through it if that's what it takes to actually keep the track attached to the foam. Does anybody even know what a hat pin is anymore? Anyway, I think the final thing to talk about with all of this woodworking is the elevated platform part of this mushroom design. I decided on about 18 inches for the platform height. When you're standing on this 18-inch platform, that 74-inch nominal benchwork height drops down to, I think, 56 inches if I'm doing my math right, which, again, that's, at least for me, it's a pretty easy reach in and accessibility for coupling, uncoupling cars, throwing switches, what have you. So I set the platforms generally at 18 inches in the upper deck area, or in the upper level of the mushroom, and for the pull-out platforms that help serve the staging yard, since at 59 and 78 inches, you're going to need some assistance to get to that top level, especially when I expect that operator to be actively fiddling cars in that area. This thing was built first before any of the rest of the railroad was in. I did use CAD to set all of this stuff up. So once everything was in place, and I brought the sections of Rice Yard out of storage and started setting those up, everything fit in where I expected it to. And then as the rest of the railroad was built from there, the rest of that raised platform could serve as a reference point for where to assemble those pieces and line everything up. There is a gap between these two sections, partly to allow for access underneath the layout. I have a ton of stuff stored under here. This provides a rollout for things like that. And then to compensate for that, I made what I call the origami floor. So this is a folding floor or bridge that stores itself under the layout. And I might do a deeper dive on how this was put together. I did film some stuff along the way. This part of the floor unfolds and attaches to the platform and part of the layout here. And then the final section drops down here with its own cantilevered supports. And then you can step up into the layout that way with the assistance of these handles. You have a simple, easy bridge to walk through here without having to go down the stairs and come back up again. And of course, if something should go pear-shaped in this area, you can reach all the way to the backdrop. And similarly, there's a need to uncouple a car or re-rail something back here. You can do that. I'm probably going to put some extra folding pieces in here so you don't accidentally fall in. That's all working out pretty well. Although again, it's still a work in progress. I want to absolutely make sure this layout is safe to operate. So before I wrap this up, I should also mention the Peninsula that I built for Oxford Street. And this is actually kind of a blend of both styles of benchwork construction. where I kept it thin in this area where the dispatcher's chair roll is, so that when you're seated in this chair, even I can comfortably roll underneath this without hitting my head underneath it. And then as you clear that area, it's a more traditional 6-inch thick style of benchwork construction. It's a nice little island in the middle of the upper level with some extra operation on it, and it's actually built on top of the platform in here because I wasn't exactly sure how the shape of this was going to shake out, and I didn't necessarily need the negative space down there to go all the way to the concrete. Besides, I built some storage areas underneath this platform, again for more garage stuff, so it made sense to just leave that area flat but for access to the storage areas, and then just build that portion of the layout directly on top of the platform. So that's the last piece of the benchwork. So anyway, I think that covers the important bits of the woodworking around here and some of the tricks I've been pulling in order to make this all work. And so I think for the next layout update, I want to talk about control systems and how I've expanded on some ideas that I've outlined before in previous videos, and show how I did that and what's different about that versus how it originally started. So until then, I'm Mike Lindsay. Thanks for coming out.